Vice's Who Killed WCW episode 3 aired last night, and I got to watch it early Wednesday morning. This episode shifted the focus away from Eric Bischoff and the run of the NWO in those great years and shifted it over to Vince Russo and his time in WCW. Now, history has not been kind to Vince Russo. Is it his fault? I would say partially, but I also think that there's a lot of misconceptions from fans. A lot of people seem to think that Vince Russo's the reason WCW died. Vince Russo may have been one cog in the wheel during a time when WCW was doing its worst television ever, but he was only a piece of the puzzle. There were a lot of other pieces. The big contracts, the fact that WWF had gotten their win back and was just steamrolling them, really partially in part to Vince Russo, ironically enough. The fact that the AOL Time Warner merger was going on and had completed by the time that WCW died and Jamie Kellner was put there, the lack of leadership, the politics, there's a lot of it. WCW died, and I haven't seen the last episode yet, it airs next week. WCW died, death by 1,000 paper cuts. But going into this episode, which I knew was going to be about Russo, I was already wondering, okay, are they going to be fair and talk about the good and the bad, or just the bad? And the reality is, most of what Russo did was bad. Conceptually, there were some ideas that could have worked. The powers that be storyline, looking back, could have worked, I think, had it been executed better. But in 2000 is when things really went, when they really hit the iceberg. You want to talk about, like, you know, the water's getting cold, like what they said in the first episode? No, folks. 2000 is when they hit the iceberg that they could not avoid. But let me talk about this episode. They first start out the episode with Bischoff being sent home, Brad Siegel, who was in charge of TNT, basically finding Bill Bush to take over WCW after Bischoff had left. And remember, Bischoff was sent home by Dr. Harvey Schiller. It was a decision that was made by Turner Brass, although this episode nor the last one, neither one actually go into who it was that made the call. Like, who actually made the final decision. I assume it was a board of people. But Bill Bush was brought in, and then he thought, well, we're going to bring in some of what made WWF successful, and that is Vince Russo and, of course, writing partner Ed Ferrara, who had been at the WWF together for a couple of years at this point. Ferrara came in at the King of the Ring 98. Russo was already writing for the magazine, and then later on became part of creative around late 96 into 97. And if you watch 96, 97, 98, 99, you cannot deny that Russo was one of the architects behind the Attitude Era. Yes, Jim Ross, Shawn Michaels, Steve Austin, Vince McMahon, Bruce Pritchard, all those guys had a hand in it. Russo deserves the credit. If you're going to give Russo the blame for WCW going down and being one of the cogs in that wheel, you have to give him the credit, because his new sort of soap opera-esque way of telling stories is kind of the way that Raw sort of still is to this day. If you watch Raw prior to like 96, you rarely, if ever, saw backstage segments and vignettes and these sort of show-long storylines that are bookended. You didn't see that stuff back then. And Nitro, I think, brought in some of that stuff, but Russo really took the soap opera to the next level and focused more on the characters and the stories than the in-ring wrestling. Obviously, if you were a fan of the in-ring style of wrestling, somebody who preferred the athleticism, sort of like a Dave Meltzer or somebody who likes Japanese, Mexican style. WWF in 99 didn't really give us a lot of that outside of some main events. TV matches were 2 minutes long, DQ finishes, sometimes very lame, sometimes things happened that made no sense. Russo, I think, worked best with an editor, and I know he hates it when people say that, but having an editor there to say, okay, let's do this, but let's tweak it a little bit. And even Russo has admitted that Vince McMahon would take his ideas and make them better. I think that also included shaving off the stuff that wasn't going to work and focusing on stuff that did work. And not everything worked, but you can't deny the success. So basically, Bill Bush signing Russo and Ferrara at the time in 99 was a very smart move. It made logical sense. People want to say he's an idiot. He's not. It made logical sense because you would think, okay, now we can bring that edge over here. The problem is you're not working for Vince McMahon anymore. You're working for a corporation. And corporations have a whole different dynamic than Vince McMahon. Now, when all of this went down, I was like 15 years old, so I didn't understand any of it. But later on, looking back and as the years went by, studying the history of the business as I got older, I did understand this was a very important move for WCW. Was it the right move? In retrospect, probably not, but it made sense for Bill Bush to do it because, hey, we're going to take a top writer from the company that's been kicking our ass for, 2 years now. We might as well. And it made sense, except that's not quite what happened because they could not capture that same, they couldn't capture the same fire, that same lightning in a bottle they had in WWF. This documentary, though, even before any of that, goes back to even 1992 when Vince, way before Vic Venom, way before Vince Russo, when he ran his video store and was first getting into the business. See, that I like that they actually sort of, in a way, kind of turned it into a bio piece on Russo before actually going into the WCW part. And the one thing that Russo was definitely right about is that in the mid-90s, the product had gotten really stale, and WWF needed to bring their product into what had become into the 90s. They were still in the 80s with the cartoon characters. In the 90s with South Park and with video games getting edgier and more violent. We got Mortal Kombat. No, wrestling needed to sort of come back to, and wrestling had been hardcore even back in the 70s, but it needed to evolve into a much more sensationalized product, and it worked. I mean, it genuinely worked. So his ideas, in theory, were correct. It was the execution that I always felt was the problem with a lot of Russo's angles. And Russo admits that he was influenced by WCW. Russo talks about he had this grand plan, and if you go back the first 3 months, you'll see it. Well, I did go back and watch it multiple times, and even though his idea, again, in theory, we're going to take the two hottest things to ever happen during the boom period, the Montreal Screwjob and the NWO, and we're going to combine them, which is what they did going into Starrcade, leading into the NWO Millennium. In theory, you would say, okay, well, logically, I know why he's doing this, but if you actually watch the television, brother, there are so many plot holes and so many illogical things. Trust me, I have done it. And I'm not even talking about the basic pro wrestling plot holes, like the logic holes that wrestling has just being wrestling. I mean, there were character motivations and there were things that had happened that just didn't make any sense. He tries to say, I mean, yes, he had the plan, but I'm not sure if they really thought it through as well as they claim to have. Booker even says that he felt like Vince was trying to entertain himself, which, I mean, the thing is, those Nitros and even Thunders, they were funny and comedic because I do think Russo does have an eye for comedy, but WCW kind of lost its identity. Not to say that WCW has to be all in-ring focused. WCW was edgy before WWF was, but now they were introducing more of the sex stuff and more of the women in scantily clad clothing, which that's what really pissed off the the suits. But the characters and the stories that they were coming up with just weren't that interesting. I don't know if they needed to get more writers and I usually am against having a large team, but I don't know what they needed, but a lot of these stories didn't really have beginning, middle, and end. That was, I think, the big problem with Russo. He's really good at writing that first chapter, but the middle and the end, I think, just aren't that great. And a lot of times stuff got dropped and changed on the fly with no explanation. he kind of started that in wrestling. I can't say he was the first one to ever do it, but he kind of made it to where it was accepted when it never should have been. Like, it just kind of became a clown show and felt very unfocused, and it is what it is. You can tell, you can tell by watching it. He also put people in comedic situations that really weren't as talented or as funny as guys like The Rock and Mick Foley and guys like that. You know what I mean? And so you're trying to sort of copy the formula, but you don't have the same players playing the right position. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, to use a sports analogy, right? If I took over, let's say, the New England Patriots in the mid-2000s, and I decided to make Tom Brady a running back, that's not what he's good at. He's a quarterback. You understand what I'm saying? Like, and there was a lot of that in WCW that didn't really hit me until being older, looking back. I think he miscast some characters. So they quickly go to January when Russo stepped down because Bill Bush wanted a committee. They say that Sullivan and those guys played politics. Sullivan took over, puts the world title on Chris Benoit at the sold out pay-per-view that was marred by injuries. Jeff Jarrett and Bret Hart both missed that show because of injuries. And by the way, this is where they should have put in the stuff about Bret and Goldberg, because it happened here. Like, it was at the month before Sold Out, Starrcade 99. That's when this happened. So then it led to Benoit, Guerrero, Malenko, and Saturn going to WWF, which I remember being, like I said, 15 years old. And when I saw those guys on Raw, I thought that was the final nail in the coffin. I really did. And maybe I was naive at the time, but I just thought, oh my God, they're here? Because those were the guys that I had been watching since ECW. Those are the guys that I knew were like the workhorses of the company. And I'm like, oh no, now WWF is going to get an influx of new talent with a ton of fresh matchups. Taz has just come in, like Kurt Angle debuted a couple months before this. Like, WWF was about to get the in-ring product elevated to where WCW was the previous year. Jericho was in WWF by this point. See what I'm saying? Like, now the in-ring for the shows like SmackDown, the extra shows besides Raw, had been elevated to a point where now WWF has everything, and WCW has the guys who had already been main eventers with a few younger guys, but those four guys were so important to the company. And it's just, as a WCW fan, you can't help but feel deflated to lose those guys. Now, Russo said that the ratings plummeted after he left during the 3 months of the they call it the Old Boys Network, which is January, February, and March, before the Bischoff and Russo union on April 10th, 2000. And the product was definitely not... I did not like the product during January, February, March of 2000. I really didn't. Look, I love old school wrestling, and they still had some good talent, but seeing those four guys leave, and I didn't know anything about the Russo story at the time, but I did revisit those Nitros it was maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I remember thinking, man, this show just feels empty. It's kind of like watching Dynamite now, how you can tell the crowds are getting smaller and it just sort of feels like you're in an empty gym. Like, it's starting to have that vibe. The crowd wasn't into it anymore. And I'm not saying that it's because Russo left. I'm saying it's because those four guys left who were the heart and soul of the company. And I think the fans knew it. But then the product just slowed down and we didn't get that quick, crash TV element that Russo had been giving us for 3.5 months. We didn't get that. So did it get better? I think in time it probably could have, because Kevin Sullivan is a great booker, but there just wasn't enough time, and there was stuff going on behind the scenes with Scott Hall, and there was a lot of stuff that wasn't really covered here that led to that time period being very problematic. Then along comes the New Blood angle, and this has been talked about to death. Bischoff's talked about it a gazillion times on his podcast. Russo's talked about it. Everyone, all the pundits have talked about it. I did a review on the KLB podcast with Draven about the April 10th, 2000 Nitro, and we have a lot of fun covering those shows because even though they were horrible in some ways, they were also wacky. But again, Russo's very good at writing Chapter 1. So the storyline of having the Millionaires Club, all the veterans, against the new blood, it logically made sense. And it's something that we could all kind of understand. These overpaid guys who have been around for too long against the young guys everybody loved. The only thing that would have made the new blood better is if they had Benoit, Eddie, Saturn, and Malenko. Because those are the guys that represented what the quote-unquote new blood was. It's like that angle was done 3 months too late. Kind of funny to think about, you know? They showed the hilarious clip of when they missed the blood dropping on Nash. And then he says, take that clip and put it next to the finger poke and then let me know what killed WCW. And it's like, but the finger poke of doom, even though the blood dropping may have been more embarrassing production-wise, the finger poke of doom killed, that entire crowd, killed the build-up. Once again, I love Kevin Nash as far as him being a charming talker, but he has not come off well on these, dude. He just hasn't. He's once again trying to minimize the damage of the finger poke of doom. We did our research, and it was about 5 months after the finger poke of doom that tickets began to drop off. And there's a correlation. There's a correlation if you look at how, usually tickets go on sale about 3 months or so before the shows. You can see it slowly begin to drop. By the time that blood angle happened on WCW Thunder, people weren't watching. The ones that were watching the Finger Poke of Doom were already gone. So it's just, it just annoys me because, man, Big Kev, I understand, look, I'm not going to beat him up because the dude lost his son a couple years ago and his best friend, and he's going through a lot, and I've been a fan of his since I was a little kid, since Big Daddy Cool Diesel, but it's just, man, he's just not coming off well on here. Just being genuine about that. Now, of course, you want to talk about WCW horrible moments, the finger poke of doom, that blood drop thing, all that stuff, all the goofy stuff Russo did. The one moment that I think everybody can point to of saying it's maybe the low point of the Russo-Bischoff era. Some would say Judy Bagwell on a pole or Goldberg turning heel. Those were all bad. David Arquette becoming world champion. I mean, that dude. And the thing is, for years they've tried to say, well, the hardcore wrestling fans, they were mad, but David Arquette was a star. Well, first of all, David Arquette was not a huge star. He was the guy from the 1-800-COLLECT commercials and Scream, right? The Scream movies, which I like. But, my God, I know that there were people who weren't even watching wrestling who had given up on WCW. When they heard about this, they were like, this is a clown show. Even casuals, people at my school, right? They were casuals. And when this happened, it was like, what are they thinking? Nobody here was one of those, message board, Tony Khan tape traders. I mean, I was, but not on the board. They didn't have internet back then, but I was trading tapes back then. But regular people thought it was dumb. It wasn't just the wrestling fans. It was just such a strange... And even though Russo will always say things like, well, it was a tag team match and all that, it doesn't matter, man. It just makes the company look bad. And was that the final nail in the coffin? Of course not, but it's another one. Remember, the story of this company dying is death by 1,000 paper cuts. Finger poke of doom, fucking up Goldberg, the NWO getting too big, fucking up the Sting finish. All these things going back to 97, little by little chipped away at the company. Russo claims that Tony Schiavone came up with the idea and that everybody in the production meeting was for it. I mean, what do you want me to tell you? I'm not sure if it even mattered at this point. It was just more to stoke the flame. And for the record, no wrestling fan that I know of actually hated David Arquette. You know what I mean? It wasn't a personal thing towards David Arquette. It was what is WCW doing? You know what I mean? What are they doing right now? I mean, we knew it was a publicity stunt. We knew that. It was obvious, but come on. And Vince Russo again defending. He's used the same defense for 20 years. We got on the cover of USA Today. Which, okay, yeah, that's true. But did it really help WCW gain eyeballs? No. What about the fact that just a few weeks ago, Tony Khan was in the middle of the draft, the NFL draft, with the neck brace on talking about AEW. Has that helped AEW gain new viewership? He was there in front of a bunch of football fans. He called WWE the Harvey Weinstein of wrestling, even though Vince is already gone by this point. Sometimes getting publicity does not necessarily mean you're going to create new viewers. There is such thing as bad publicity. That idea is very, I think it's very naive to think that there's no such thing. I think the most interesting thing that I was not expecting is Booker on here confessing when they asked him, why do you think you would never, because he did become the WCW World Champion in July, Bash of the Beast 2000, but they asked him, why did you think you would never become champion? He said, because I was black. That was surprising. You know, Ron Simmons had been WCW champion in the Bill Watts era. Was there something else going on that we don't know about? Well, remember, there was a racist or a racial lawsuit that WCW was hit with around this time. So maybe there's more to it. Maybe there's stories that Booker has kept to himself. I don't know. So they revisit the infamous Bash 2000 with Hogan and all that and the Russo promo. This got its own Vice documentary. Dark Side of the Ring had covered this. So there isn't much new added. It's just sort of being put here because it kind of needs to be, because it is another one of those pivotal events. I noticed they skipped over like Goldberg's heel turn, which it didn't work. That within 2 months they went back to him being a babyface. But the Goldberg heel turn was again another nail in the coffin, another paper cut. You know, it was a bad move to do at that time, but not as important as this. Especially with how much Hogan had meant to WCW going back to 94. So they actually moved past Bash of the Beast 2000, which I think a lot of people forget there is more to the story, into the Long Island Nitro where Russo won the WCW World title. And that was actually the beginning of the end for him because he had a concussion because Goldberg speared him through the cage. That's how he won the title. And he, of course, gave up the title and so on and so forth, just like David Arquette. Again, you're playing with the belt, the prop, as Russo would say. But when he got the concussion, he pretty much just went home after that. And what we have left with is this really strange time period from, I want to say, October, November 2000 to 2001, where I don't even know what you would even call this time period. Maybe the death years, because the audience had dropped. A lot of the guys were out. A lot of the guys were hurt. People were leaving left and right. This was like, you could tell that this was going in a direction they wouldn't come back from, and they wouldn't. They never did. What's interesting is that Russo says that he thinks Goldberg was intentionally trying to hurt him, which I don't understand why Bill would do that. Bill has hurt people, but not intentionally. I'm not sure about that one. Next week, the final episode, which is the one I've been waiting for. How did the company end up under Vince? What happened with Bischoff and Fusion? It's been talked about a lot. I know the story, but there is some footage that I had not seen before that was shown in the preview clips. And next week's the one that I'm really curious about. So we'll see. We'll see where it goes. This has been a fun trip down memory lane, and nostalgic, but also sad because I lived through this, and it's just a bummer. It really is. It was a fun time in 95, 96, 97, 98 even. But man, did this thing sink fast. Those are my thoughts on episode 3.